Dr. Karan, the dumbest health trend of 2024, CGM, or continuous glucose monitor.
Health influencers have found a brand new wellness trend.
Continuous glucose monitoring.
Continuous glucose monitor.
Continuous glucose monitor.
Are these glucose monitoring gizmos really all they're cracked up to be? Or could those blood sugar spikes you've heard so much about not quite be the biological boogeyman you've been led to believe?
And it completely changed my life.
Well, he said that he had been tracking his blood sugar for weeks and that he was learning how the foods that he was eating, they were high in sugar.
Well, to answer that question, I'm going to run a simple experiment on myself. I'm going to wear this continuous glucose monitor, the CGM.
I rock one of those too.
And use it to compare my glucose response to two different foods. One undeniably healthy, a luscious red apple, and the other, well, you know.
Before we even see the results, you're choosing one food that is very carb heavy. Granted, yes, apples do have a little bit of fiber, but and I guess fiber is a carb, undigestible carb. But you're having something that's very sugary and doesn't have much fat or protein versus something that does have fat, protein, and carbs. And that alone is going to blunt, but let's see what happens.
We'll see which one is the best for me based on the glucose spike it provokes. Now, let's take a look at those readings. I ate an apple and this fried chicken hot wing, and which one would you assume gave me the biggest spike? That's right, it's the apple. To just look at these readings, you'd have to conclude that this piece of fruit with its fiber, water, and vitamins was worse for me than this ultra-processed fried chicken with its salt and fat.
Yeah, well, the spike is very similar. First impressions, though, I mean, this is not a very fair test. You have the apple at 8:27 p.m. and the KFC at 11 a.m. The time of day very much influences your insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity. So in the morning, people are the most insulin sensitive in the mornings, which means you're going to have less of a spike, actually, if you have that same food later in the evening. Because you have less insulin sensitivity, you will actually spike harder. So he's having the apple very late at night, after dinner time for most of us, and having KFC before noon. So that already is not a fair test. Also, the important thing to keep in mind is that CGM, blood sugar, is just one variable, one metric. It is important, but it's not the only variable. So I could eat cheese or bacon for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and I would have a phenomenal flat CGM tracing. My blood sugar would be very flat without spikes. But obviously, far from an optimal diet. It's just one variable that you consider, but you don't optimize for only that. And I get the point that Karan is making, because a lot of people that don't understand that may over-optimize for just CGM readings, not realizing that it is a single variable. The equivalent would be, I go on my bathroom scale every morning and I'm trying to optimize for reducing that weight. Let's say I go on Ozempic and I lose a lot of weight, but a lot of that weight is muscle mass. That's not good, right? There's ways to combat that with protein and exercise, but another one would be, let's say you're regular with your smoking and cocaine use, like various stimulants. You'll lose weight, but that's obviously not healthy. Yeah, so no one who seriously understands nutrition or is even promoting CGMs would argue that the fried chicken is better than the apple. Again, a little bit of a straw man argument here. CGM is just one variable. It's not the only thing you optimize for. And you can't say a food is healthy or unhealthy just based on CGM readings.
And this is the problem with CGMs. They only tell you about one thing, glucose spikes, which, by the way, are a perfectly normal response to eating just about anything.
But every single thing you measure is just one thing, right? I look at my total body weight, but also my body fat, body composition, how much visceral body fat, how much subcutaneous body fat. It's not just one thing you're optimizing for. You need many more data points to have the context.
Like most things in life, our health depends on much more than one factor. But even if glucose spikes were as important as influencers and celebrity doctors tell us, do you even have any control over them in the first place?
You do. You definitely do. And there are many different behaviors that I have found, because I've been wearing a CGM almost daily now since like pre-pandemic 2019. And I'll have like breaks here and there, but I've had many learnings. I actually cover a lot of those learnings here, like time of day, how exercise influences it, stress, sleep, the order in which you eat food matters. Like there's so many different things that actually contribute to this, and we'll get to why it is so important later in the video. It's not actually glucose you're optimizing for, actually. You're using it as a proxy for something else.
Let's play a quick game. Which of these do you think can impact your blood glucose? The amount of sleep you've had, how much exercise you're doing, your levels of stress, periods of illness, or whether you're menstruating or not.
Okay, so again, straw manning here by saying that you don't have control and then listing all these various things that influence it. I do have control over my sleep. I have control over my exercise. I have control of my levels of stress and how I manage my stress. I have control over healthy and unhealthy habits to minimize the risk of being ill. And if I am actually ill, then like, and I have high cortisol and whatever, I'm not focusing on trying to optimize my CGM reading. I'm just focusing on trying to get better and kick the viral infection or whatever it is.
The answer is all of them. And if there's one thing you should take away from this video, it's that blood glucose is like a moody teenager, affected by everything and impossible to understand what's really making it act up.
I don't like that. That's very much a external locus of control. I think most people would agree you 100% have control, not complete control, but a high degree of control over all those different variables. And to say that it's just a moody teenager that you can't control, that's promoting very strongly an external locus of control. You need to have an internal locus of control if you want to handle your health and actually make improvements. For those who don't know, I have inflammatory bowel disease. I've been hospitalized. I've gotten like 8 colonoscopies, even though I'm 34. Like, it has been very challenging, and it's not easy. And I talk a lot more about it on the channel and other videos. But I only got to the point where I am today, where I exercise like 10 to 15 hours per week. I eat pretty well. I'm actually able to eat just about everything now, most things. Whereas when I first got sick, I was literally eating white rice and white noodles and like chicken breast with only salt. It was terrible. And actually before that, I was even on a full liquid diet for several weeks. I only got to where I am by having an internal locus of control and understanding that I can do things that influence my disease process versus throwing in the towel and saying, oh man, I'm doomed. I have this autoimmune condition. Woe is me. Yeah, man, it sucks. But like, that's the cards that I'm dealt. What am I going to do with it? Similarly, I mean, like, controlling these things is way easier. It's way smaller. You guys can definitely control these.
Imagine being a new mother. You've been up all night, feeding your tiny human, and you're shattered. Your partner's gone to work, and now you're left alone with a screaming gremlin who even Super Nanny would probably hand an iPad to. You're exhausted and stressed, and in a fit of madness, you decide to throw a CGM into the mix because some influencer on TikTok is doing the same. And what a surprise. You've registered a massive glucose spike straight after breakfast.
Well, yeah, if you're having that breakfast with pancakes and bread, yeah, you're probably going to have a spike. We've had such terrible outcomes with health over the last century or so because this modern diet, which has only really been around for like the last century and a half, is like, our body has not evolved for this. We are not used to having highly processed carbs like pancakes and toast and all this stuff. Like, we tend to overconsume carbs. Now, I am South Asian. I am Punjabi, a region of India. Karan here is obviously also South Asian. And South Asians in particular, we tend to eat a crap ton of carbs at default, just based on our cuisine. And we also tend to have, unfortunately, suboptimal genetics for metabolic health. And we are at higher risk of diabetes. Everyone in my family, in my immediate family, other than me, is either pre-diabetic or diabetic. That's not like an unchangeable fate. I can control that. And I talk about how I'm changing that here. All the different things. I'm like, you're not doomed. I've had one commenter who's really stuck in my head because he said, hey, Kevin, like, everyone in my family is diabetic. Why should I even try? I'm just doomed to get it. Let's start with your breakfast. Let's start with some of these habits. Like, if you're eating that as your breakfast, you're going to have a bad time. And yeah, it's unfair. We have to try a little bit harder than those people who don't have diabetes rampant in their family. And like, the people in my family who have diabetes and prediabetes, my parents, my sibling, they're either normal BMI or just like overweight BMI, not obese either. Again, internal locus of control.
How can you possibly know which of the factors I just mentioned, including the guilt you feel for pacifying your infant with a screen, are causing the spike? It's impossible to say.
Well, no, it's not impossible to say. Again, we outlined, when you have the understanding and the data, you can see all these various factors. Now, that mom would not want to get overly focused on trying to perfect your CGM. Certain people, they'll wear a sleep tracker, right? Whether it's a Ring or Apple Watch or whatever sleep tracker. And if they don't have perfect sleep scores, they'll like get stressed. And even as they're falling asleep, they'll like worry about their sleep score. Some people are wired like that. Some people aren't. And you just need to be mindful as to how you relate to data. I've always just used it as like a tracking mechanism and been curious about it, but it's never caused me stress. So I track a lot of different things. But if you get that orthosomnia where you are stressed out as you fall asleep, then yeah, you want to change your relationship or change your usage, or maybe even stop using your sleep tracker if it's causing issues. Same thing with the CGM. When I'm sick or low on sleep, as I am today, I'm not overly stressed about having a perfect CGM curve. I'm just using it as data points. And I also want to see my average blood sugar and standard deviation at certain ranges, which we'll get to soon. This mother, in this example, should not be stressed about a perfect blood sugar curve.
There's absolutely nothing you can do to prevent your blood sugar spiking in response to the events I just mentioned, so there's absolutely no point worrying about them. Yet wearing a CGM will be nothing but a constant reminder of just how spiky your glucose is. And this really gets to the heart of the problem with healthy people wearing CGMs. Physical health is the result of a complex array of interacting factors, some of which, like our genes, are not even under our control. It's impossible to measure all of these factors. Instead, we prefer to collapse all that nuance into a single number, our blood glucose, because it's easy to measure and we end up giving that number way more significance than it really deserves.
I like that he mentioned the genetics as well. And again, genetics can make things easier or harder for you, but that doesn't mean that you are doomed one way or another. And it doesn't mean your blood sugar is out of your control. So the reason it's actually incredibly powerful is the tight feedback loop. So you will do a behavior, whether it's sleep related, food related, exercise related, and immediately within minutes to hours, see a difference in your blood sugar. Now, when you first start wearing a CGM, the experience for most people, let's say the first month or so, or first few weeks, is a lot of insight and surprise, like, oh wow, I had no idea that my blood sugar would spike here. And you're just in this phase of gaining some insight as to what does and does not change your blood sugar. Certain foods that you thought were healthy, oops, maybe they're not as good for me as I thought. Or maybe the way you're eating them or the time you're eating them, right? And then you move on to the second phase where you start having behavior change. Behavior change is much more available and low friction when you have a tight feedback loop. So now when you know that eating a certain food or doing a certain behavior is going to cause a sugar spike, you're more inclined to not do it because you don't want to see that spike, right? It's actually the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is that individuals who are being observed, which in this case, the CGM is like observing you, it's telling you your blood sugar, they change their behavior as a result. And this happens here too. Like people modifying their behavior when they're being watched, they are going to eat healthier when they have a CGM.
Yes, it's true that what gets measured gets managed, and blood pressure is a perfect example of that. But at the other end of that spectrum, we have Goodhart's law, which tells us when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Which again is why you don't want to optimize for only blood sugar. You want to use it as one of the tools that guides various decisions about your nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress.
Imagine a hospital was given a target, so all of its patients who walked in through its doors were seen by a doctor within 10 minutes. Sounds good, right? That's really putting the patient first. Well, it might seem like that on the surface, but what about when the hospital's understaffed? When an emergency is happening? What if the number of patients attending the hospital goes up by a quarter? Then the only way the staff can meet the target is by rushing through consultations or procedures and compromising patient care. Focusing solely on a single measure in isolation can lead to all sorts of perverse outcomes, and that sums up blood glucose measurements in healthy people to a T.
So he makes a good point that, any single overly optimized measure results in perverse incentives. And as Charlie Munger once said, show me the incentives, I'll show you the outcomes. But we're really throwing the baby out with the bathwater here if we're saying that healthy people, and by the way, like 80+% of people in the US have metabolic dysfunction, even if you're not fully diabetic, you can have metabolic dysfunction. I wouldn't call that healthy, right? They're just below this arbitrary threshold we have of diabetes, pre-diabetes, when it's a continuum.
We've all encountered obsessive calorie counters or step counters who become so fixated on reaching their arbitrary goal, they lose sight of the forest for the trees. If you can't eat anything without first worrying about your glucose response to it, are you denying yourself your favorite food even occasionally, and what impact is that device really having on your life? Remember too that one guaranteed way of flattening a glucose curve is to eat high-fat foods or drastically reduce your consumption of carbohydrates. Despite what you may hear on TikTok, carbs are not your enemy.
I would actually say that processed, refined carbs very much are your enemy. And in modern society, like having white bread, having a burger here, that's really not something that should be normalized. And yeah, we should, a lot of us should actually work on reducing our processed carbohydrates. Fiber is good. Fiber is a type of carb. But when I'm talking about processed carbohydrates, I'm talking about things like this white bread. And fats aren't necessarily bad. Like there are different types of fats that you want to include in your diet. Generally speaking, we're over-consuming saturated fat. But like if I'm having more monounsaturated fat, more avocado as an example, more olive oil as an example, that's not necessarily a problem either. There's so much nuance when it comes to nutrition, and a lot of us want to, again, we're humans, we like simplicity. We want to just brush with these broad strokes and say, carbs good or bad, fats good or bad. It's like, well, types of carbs good or bad, types of fat good or bad. Even protein, right? There are some higher and lower bioavailability types of protein, some proteins that are more complete, some proteins that are more incomplete.
It's easy to see how obsessing over CGM readings could lead to people eating all sorts of unbalanced diets just so their blood glucose levels stay low. I can see two potential negative outcomes from this. One, I can imagine seeing individuals with deranged blood lipid profiles from eating high-fat diets, which exposes them to all sorts of negative cardiovascular health outcomes.
So valid point that for those who have certain concerning lipid profiles, they would want to avoid things like saturated fat as an example, which for some people will increase that further. However, also having a lot of processed carbs and having these high blood sugar spikes and insulin going through the roof too is also actually very harmful for cardiovascular disease. One thing that a lot of us don't appreciate is that insulin is the hormone released by the pancreas that tells cells to take up glucose from the blood. And insulin resistance, the most extreme example being type 2 diabetes, but again, it's a spectrum. That's what we're trying to avoid here. And insulin resistance, which is caused by these multiple insults, and this develops long-term with a lot of these insults over time. It increases your risk of dying from cardiovascular disease by almost 6x. It increases your risk of cancer by 12x. Alzheimer's disease, 5x. This is why addressing metabolic dysfunction is so important if you want to live a long and healthy life.
Second, I worry that obsessive use of CGMs and a fixation on an arbitrary number and the demonization of carbohydrates in particular could lead to disordered eating behaviors, which frankly, I wouldn't wish on anyone.
Yeah, and that's a valid point. I would say that it's a very, very small minority of people that would have these disordered eating behaviors, and there's ways to address that and minimize that risk, right? With a lot of education, and they're working with their doctor. And again, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Let me tell you about that now. CGMs don't actually measure the glucose in your blood. Rather, they measure glucose in the interstitial fluid, the ISF, and that's the fluid between cells. The problem with this is that glucose levels in the interstitial fluid tend to change slower than a tortoise getting out of bed.
They do lag behind your blood sugar because your interstitial fluid is essentially being supplied by blood, but blood is passing through your veins, your arteries, your capillaries faster, and then some of this fluid is going into your interstitial fluid. It is slower to react, but it's still actually a very decent proxy. And again, whether it's 110 or 112, we don't need the most accurate numbers here. We're looking at trends, curves, and approximating our insulin levels, actually.
Much more slowly than glucose levels change in blood vessels, and this causes a lag between the two. In other words, what you see on a CGM may not be the real amount of glucose in your capillaries.
Which is fine, because if your blood sugar spikes and your interstitial sugar is spiking a little bit later, you're still getting the spike just slightly later. And even if the magnitude isn't exactly the same, again, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Well, you'll be pleased to hear that you have more in common with elite athletes than you think. When a group of participants aged between 60 and 85, so hardly professional sports people, had their blood glucose tested with either a CGM, a finger stick instrument, or the gold standard laboratory test, not only was the CGM the least accurate of the three, but it underestimated the increase in blood glucose for 8 hours after finishing a meal. So as both of these studies show, you cannot assume that what CGMs show you really is an accurate reading of your blood glucose.
It is going to be accurate enough for the purposes of seeing how your behaviors influence your blood sugar. And again, we're looking at averages, we're looking at spikes, we're looking at the curves and the trends here, and saying, was my blood sugar exactly 95 versus 97 at this moment, or was it 130 versus 120 at this other moment, is not the focus.
To listen to some CGM zealots talk, you'd think that monitoring your blood glucose was the be-all and end-all of human health, when nothing could be further from the truth. If your doctor suspects you may be at risk of any kind of underlying metabolic disorder, they may well measure your blood glucose. However, they'll also be interested in your blood pressure, your weight, your family history of diabetes, and many other lifestyle factors, such as whether you smoke or drink or how much exercise you do.
Yeah, again, it's, as we were mentioning earlier, this is just one variable that you shouldn't over-optimize for, but it is a very useful and worthwhile variable to be monitoring and acting upon.
It's the combination of these risk factors that increases someone's probability of developing type 2 diabetes. But be honest, how many fitness influencers out there encourage you to check your blood pressure or waist measurement as often as they check their blood glucose?
You should check your blood pressure. That's why I keep a cuff at my desk. The reason I do it at my desk is that you want to be sitting stationary for at least 5 minutes. So like at my desk is where I'm going to be sitting stationary. So I measure my blood pressure here, and then scales in the bathroom every morning after you use the restroom is the most consistent time. Also a good habit. Actually, I cover a lot of these things in that video on how to overcome the odds if you have higher risk, like family history and suboptimal genetics and such, which I do, right? And I talk about that here.
About as many of them that post content of themselves without filters. Don't forget, so-called glucose spikes are part of our body's natural response to certain foods. In fact, Dr. Peter Attia, one of the most prominent proponents of CGMs himself, acknowledges there is no scientific data showing the use of CGM leads to long-term health benefits in people who don't have type 2 diabetes.
Okay. Is there a randomized control trial demonstrating the efficacy of CGM in anything outside of patients with diabetes? There is not.
So I mean, that's a very brief excerpt of Peter Attia that I think is not telling the full story, right? So if you read Peter Attia's Outlive, I did, by the way, a full 1 hour book summary, very in depth, which covers all of this in greater detail as well. But even in the book, he points out, even though there aren't studies showing CGMs in non-diabetics being beneficial, a lot of these like evidence-based medicine zealots, they tend to over-index on only doing things that have very robust scientific evidence for. And I've talked about this many times on the channel because in med school, like that, I mean, I was in med school in the 2010s and like it was very much the focus, evidence-based medicine, evidence-based medicine. But evidence-based medicine is largely misunderstood by a lot of doctors. And I've seen this time and time again, both amongst my colleagues and also like my physician that's treating me for like my IBD as an example. Evidence-based medicine is, yes, you rely on the best that the scientific literature has to offer, but you also use clinical judgment and patient desires and wishes and autonomy and preferences as well. And those three things combined is what leads evidence-based medicine. But because evidence-based medicine has been so misunderstood and focuses just on that first thing of scientific literature and doesn't focus on clinical judgment, we now have to use a different term of like evidence-informed medicine and various other terms that distinguish themselves as separate. So even in Outlive, Attia will admit that there are no randomized controlled trials, but these studies are likely coming. To have good studies, given the outcomes that we're looking for, it's not going to get done in a week, a month, a year, right? So these take time. But even still, there are already data that are showing how important it is to keep blood glucose low and stable. So a 2011 study was looking at 20,000 people, mostly without type 2 diabetes, and it found that their risk of mortality increased monotonically with their average blood glucose levels, which was approximated via hemoglobin A1C. And the higher their blood glucose, the greater the risk of death, even in the non-diabetic range of blood glucose. There was also this 2019 study that was looking at the degree of variability in a subject's blood sugar, and it found that people with the highest quartile of variability, meaning the blood sugar is going up and down, they had a 2.67 times greater risk of mortality than those in the lowest quartile, those who had the most stable blood sugar that wasn't changing all that much. So from these studies, it seems quite clear that we want to lower average blood sugar levels and also reduce the amount of variability, that up and down motion of our blood sugar across time. And the CGM is a very useful tool in doing that.
CGM costs can easily run into the hundreds or even thousands of pounds per year. I mean, I had to spend £80 on this thing just for the sake of this video, and it's only for a 2-week trial. As well as the monitor itself, you need the breathable sensor tape and the waterproof sensor covers as well.
Well, the sensor tape and the covers are very cheap, and those are actually also optional. I generally don't rock them personally. So yeah, a CGM is going to be like $100-$150 per month. And I don't think a lot of people need to wear it all the time like I do. I'm a data nerd and I find value in wearing it all the time, but I think a lot of people will find value just from wearing a CGM for a couple months and changing their behaviors after that. It's so deceptive to just talk about the upfront cost of this versus the hidden cost, the long-term cost of not optimizing metabolic health, right? So if you end up having metabolic dysfunction, prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, that is going to be much more expensive. Not just the healthcare costs and the risk of being at a much higher risk of other medical conditions, but let's just talk about the direct cost of like insulin, right? If you got to the point where you needed actual insulin, that's not cheap either, right? And that's not something that you just trial for a couple months. That's something that you would have to be on long term.
Well, why bother with financial stability when you could have a cupboard full of miracle cures and snake oil accessories? Let's be clear on one thing. There are people out there making a lot of money from selling products and supplements to healthy people in order to control a natural physiological reaction on the basis of fear, on the basis that you should be afraid of the way your body naturally works. To me, this is nothing more than a marketing scam. Maybe the problem begins with companies and certain well-known individuals, but it quickly gets blown out of proportion by ill-informed influencers who either haven't done their research or are simply out to make a quick buck, or both.
That's a fair point, right? I personally don't watch a lot of content that, like, where influencers are promoting CGMs. And unfortunately with social media, you're going to find people who they're optimizing for clicks and views. And I would actually argue that even videos like this, where you say everything is, like, this is a dumb health trend, and this is really bad, or this is the best thing, this is really good, and going black and white, going extreme versus talking to the gray area, the nuance, and educating people to say, hey, this is good, it's a tool, and it has some things you need to be aware of, and don't optimize it only for this. And like, you educate people honestly and thoroughly, and you give them the tools to make the most out of using a CGM. I wish that more of us were focused on that middle path of educating and empowering. And unfortunately with social media, like, it's like clicks, and just like, take the most extreme thing, really good, really bad. And it is a bit ironic. I think Karan is validly pointing out that some social media influencers, some of these fitness people that may not know, that may not understand CGMs that well and body physiology, are over-indexing on its importance and misleading their audience. But I mean, also, I think, isn't Karan kind of doing the same thing in the opposite direction by demonizing it and making it seem really harmful and bad, when in reality it is a very useful tool?
But does that mean there's no one out there apart from diabetes sufferers who might benefit from using a CGM? Well, possibly not, but here's one example. Athletes undergoing prolonged, moderate or high intensity exercise need to consume carbs while they're exercising to fuel their activity. To be clear, we're talking here about people who can do endurance exercises like cycling for hours at a time. The length of exercise they engage in, the intensity at which they're doing it, and where they are all play a role in determining how much glucose these individuals need. Selective use of a CGM could play a role in managing these calculations.
Yeah, actually, I just did a 3-hour bike ride on Sunday. And let's see, I was refueling every hour or so on that bike ride. And the funny thing is that based on your exercise intensity and what you're eating, because you're going through that fuel so quickly, you may or may not spike. Like, when you go super intense sprints, I found that, yes, I'm going to have some blood sugar spikes. Those are okay spikes though, right? If a spike is induced by heavy intensity exercise, I'm not worried about it. Here, because I was at a pretty moderate, it was like a 3-hour pretty intense bike ride, but not sprints. As I was having these very carbohydrate heavy, like no fiber, no fat, no protein, just like carbs. I was actually very flat with my blood sugar, relatively speaking. And that's because I'm burning it as quickly as I'm consuming it. Actually, even slightly faster. But regardless, this here is like an instance where, by being educated, I'm not going to, let's say I did have some spikes because I was doing sprints, or I fueled up in a way where I was getting some spikes, I wouldn't be stressed about it, because I would then have the context to understand that it's not a problem in this instance.
But by the time an elite level athlete arrives at the point at which they need to monitor their carb intake, they're already highly trained in their sport. They've optimized their nutrition and probably many other aspects of their life. And when they reach for a CGM, it will be in full knowledge of its limitations. And as always, it's what you do with the information you get from any test that really matters, not the data itself. With that in mind, what easy actions can you take to manage your blood glucose without shelling £100 a month plus for this device? Let's play another quick game. Which of the following would you guess can lower blood glucose in a diabetic individual? Eating more fiber, going for a walk after eating a meal, getting enough sleep, or eating fats and proteins before you eat carbs?
These are all things that you can control, and yes, you should do these things.
The answer is all of them. If you're suffering from diabetes, all of these options are valuable tools to help you manage your condition, and you certainly don't need to wear a CGM to tell you that.
Yeah, but you doing those things and then actually having the feedback loop to knowing how much they are helping or not, how long of a walk do you need to go for, how fast do you need to go? Is walking for 5 minutes at a slow pace enough, or do you need to walk at a moderate pace for 15? Based on my experience, I can tell you I have a range where things work well for me. If you just tell someone to go for a walk and they're going too slow, then they're going to spike. If they're going at the right pace, they're really going to notice a blunting of that spike. These behaviors are good, and then being able to track and manage them and understand them with a tight feedback loop just makes it more powerful and the behavior change is more likely to stick. And
in fact, eating more fiber, going for more walks, and getting more sleep is good advice for pretty much all of us.
yeah, I mean, it's good advice, but how many of us follow that? And when you have a tight feedback loop and when you have Hawthorne effect, you're going to notice your behavior change more. I know I should be living this perfect idealized life, but life happens and none of us live a perfect idealized life. So this helps us to guide decisions. I am now much less likely to eat late at night, as an example. I am much more likely today, because I'm sleep deprived, to not be as indulgent, because I know that if I am indulgent today, since I'm sleep deprived, I'm going to spike way harder versus tomorrow when I'm not going to be sleep deprived. I'll leave you guys with a story that I've told a few times on the channel that really highlights what I think is a fundamental issue with how a lot of physicians are trained to approach medicine. So my GI doc is one of these like very evidence-based, dogmatic kinds of physicians. And a few years ago, a study came out, weaker evidence, that vitamin D supplementation may help individuals with IBD to remain in remission. And I asked him, hey, like, I know this study is highly flawed and there's a lot of confounding variables here, but wouldn't it be worthwhile? He said, no, absolutely not. It's clearly not helping with remission. It's clearly these confounding variables that are more important. And I was like, well, I agree there are confounding variables, but I mean, you can't actually know. It's all a risk game. So like, I understand I've done a lot of research in my time and there are significant limitations here, but you want to always approach these decisions through a asymmetric risk perspective. So if the risk is relatively low by me doing vitamin D supplementation, assuming I'm using a high quality supplement and not mega dosing, reasonable dose, high quality supplement, what is the possible downside other than, paying the $10 per month or whatever it is? Pretty low risk. What's the possible upside? For me to remain in remission and avoid a flare, incredible. I would pay thousands of dollars to avoid a flare. Huge. A few years later, another study came out. Stronger level of evidence that was suggesting the same, that vitamin D supplementation actually may be causal in helping patients with IBD remain in remission. And I brought this study up and he was like, oh, it's still not. I'm like, look, every study is going to have limitations, but now the level of evidence is stronger. And even still, you're against this. I think what we have to do is remember that at the end of the day, you will never have perfect data, perfect research, perfect conclusions, and you have to use some judgment. This, I think, is a clear example. And I told him, like, hey, I'm going to supplement with vitamin D because I'm on the lower end of normal. And there's an asymmetric risk profile here where I have very low risk, possibly very high reward. And maybe it does nothing. Worst case, I wasted $10 a month, whatever. And it's through that lens that we should be approaching other healthcare decisions, things like CGMs and other interventions, rather than just going based on dogma of what is absolutely supported by the research. I don't need a research study to tell me that I shouldn't jump out of this window because I'm probably going to hurt myself, right? I'm using judgment to make some decisions based on other understandings I have of physics, the world, risk, upside, downside. And we can do that in medicine too.